When I started the Everything Wrong With series by talking about Halo's Scorpion tank, I tried to redesign it to be more practical as part of the video. I didn't do it for future videos because of time constraints, and, well, I honestly forgot about it. But I figured by splitting them into two different series, I could cover both aspects in much greater detail. The first episode of this series is going to focus on Fallout 4's tank and APC. I wasn't particularly impressed with either of them, so I'll be able to make a fair number of changes. One of my problems with the tank was that it relied too much on nuclear technology. Obviously this makes more sense through the lens of the Fallout universe, but it's still not a great idea. So with that in mind, I'll be making a redesigned tank that uses nuclear technology, and one that doesn't. Let's start with the nuclear tank first. Thankfully, the United States did a ton of experimentation with tanks during the Cold War, so I have a lot of material to draw inspiration from. One of my main criticisms was the very odd hull layout, which moved the driver to the turret so it could have what looks to be a second engine. This really weird configuration would leave the driver disoriented, and make the hull easy to penetrate, thanks to its flat surface. To remedy this, we'll want to angle the front pretty heavily and move the driver back to the hull. The US has traditionally put their engines in the back, so the engine will go there, allowing for the driver to be placed in the center of the hull. This type of hull sounds most similar to the T-95 experimental medium tank. Using the T-95's hull would allow the tank to retain the low silhouette that I praised it for having. Now let's talk about the engine. Some engine components on the Fallout tank seem to be exposed needlessly. Chrysler briefly considered a tank called the TV-8. One of its proposed engine types was a vapor cycle power plant fed by nuclear fuel. We could use a similar engine for our tank, but situated under the tank's armor. Having such an engine would mean that a lot of radiation shielding would need to be installed for the crew's safety. For the weapons, we'll only be using one gun instead of two, in order to leave more room for the crew members. The Fallout 4 tank is supposed to use 140mm cannons, which is a good thing, since the larger size would allow them to use more nuclear material for the shells. I figured that this concept could be taken further by replacing the cannons with a 152mm gun launcher. If your tank is firing nuclear rounds, velocity isn't going to be much of a concern. Switching to a gun launcher would give the tank more range and accuracy. Other options that fit the universe would be a Gauss cannon or a laser cannon, but if everyone is already slinging nukes around, you might as well do it too, since that's about the simplest way to be as destructive as possible. Historically, the US had a lot of issues with the gun launcher concept, but I think it'd be alright here. You could also call the nuclear missiles tall boys to fit with the Fat Man theme. We'll also be adding a coaxial machine gun and a machine gun for the commander. The commander's machine gun will be enclosed in his cupola, so he can fire it while being protected from nuclear hazards. For the tracks, we'll be removing the quad tracks in favor of the more traditional dual track design, since quad tracks don't offer any real tangible advantage. Luckily for me, the army already made a tank that looks almost exactly what I'm describing, with the only exceptions being that the driver is in the turret and that it uses a diesel engine instead of a nuclear one, and it obviously isn't firing mini ICBMs. But I really like the way this tank looks. It still looks distinctly American while also having a sort of retro-futuristic vibe to it. I think it would fit into the Fallout universe pretty well, all things considered. Now let's try to design a tank that doesn't incorporate nuclear components. To replace the engine, we have to take into consideration what kind of resource situation the US is in. In Fallout, there's a pretty severe resource shortage, especially for oil. With that in mind, giving our tank a turbine engine might be a good idea. Turbine engines are pretty good at running on just about any fuel you put in them, with differing performance results of course. That's one of the reasons why the Abrams utilizes a turbine engine. The US anticipated having a lot of difficulty delivering fuel in a Cold War gone hot scenario. As for replacing the gun, I think a standard 105mm cannon would suffice. I don't think composite armor has really been invented in the Fallout universe, so anything more than a 105 would probably be overkill. If you wanted to spice things up a little bit, you could replace it with a Gauss cannon or a laser cannon. The gun could be fed by an autoloader, but the US has been fairly averse to using them. They did a lot of experimentation with a revolving drum design, though it took up a decent amount of space, and using one would mean that the turret has to be oscillating, which means that the crew cannot have NBC protection. NBC protection should obviously be a top priority in the Fallout universe. For the hull, we could stick to the T-95 hull or use the M48's. The T-95's hull is lower profile, but I believe that the extra height afforded by the M48's hull would allow for the installation of a more powerful engine. That, or the T-95's rear hull could be modified to accommodate one. All other changes remain pretty much the same, so dual tracks and added machine guns. Just like with the nuclear tank, a design very similar to this tank already exists, for both the T-95 and M48 hull options. Personally, I prefer the T-95 option. T-95 hull has a lower profile and better ballistic protection, but the M48 hull does look a bit more retro. For both tanks, you could add a lot of peripheral equipment. Scaled down laser weapons are commonplace within the setting, and robotics are fairly advanced as well. With these, you can make a subturret which tracks and destroys incoming anti-tank rockets. Perhaps the tank could somehow integrate stealth boy technology so that it can be invisible for brief periods of time, or at least mostly invisible. Now onto the APC. My main problems with the APC were that it was way too tall, and that it had very poor weapon arrangements. To start, I think a track chassis would be much better than a wheeled one. A wheeled vehicle would make sense if the units we see in Fallout 4 were National Guard, but I think they're regular army units. I figured that the product improved M113A1 would be a good reference. The PI M113A1 had a 20mm cannon as part of its armament, but we're going to replace that with a 106mm recoilless rifle. A recoilless rifle would be ideal for this type of vehicle, because it allows for both anti-armor and anti-personnel capabilities, and a conventional cannon likely couldn't be supported by this type of vehicle. We'll be using the turret from the T114 BAT, since it allowed for multiple shots in rapid succession, and allowed the gunner to fire from relative safety. The only issue is a lack of coaxial machine gun, but I think one could be added with minor modifications. All I had to do for this one was very hastily Photoshop a T114 turret onto a photo of the PI M113A1. I think it looks alright, but it would fit Fallout's aesthetic more if you made some of those sharp edges more curvy. But beyond that, I think this would be a much more practical vehicle. And that's the end of the video. As always, I hope you guys enjoyed it.